Okay, Khaled, let me know when we're ready to go. I don't know if you want to give it a minute to
Yeah,
let
I think
everybody
people
in.
are kind of joining in, but I think we can go ahead and get started.
All right. Well, look, hey, everybody. I hope everybody is well today. My name is Andy Clark. So I'm the compere for the event today. Most of the heavy lifting for today, of course, will be from Khaled, Nicola, and Govind. But just to start off, this is an important topic, I think, and thanks for Khaled and Govind in putting all of this together. And I think there are three really important parts for everybody to go and focus on in terms of what we're going to talk about today. So the first one is fabric costs, and and I think in the overall scheme of things with Microsoft licensing, and I'm an ex-Microsoft employee and now Microsoft partner. Microsoft licensing can be intensely and incredibly complicated, as licensing can be in any vendor. It's not a Microsoft thing. And overall fabric licensing is actually pretty simple. It is, it's reasonably easy to go and wrap your head around, and we're going to talk about that. So to make sure you understand how fabric licensing works and just a few of the nuances. But I think more importantly than fabric licensing is the way that you can manage fabric licensing. And we've got some really important lessons from what Khaled and team have worked on, from what Nicola has been working on, in terms of being able to make sure that you get the best and the benefits and you get all the goodness from fabric in terms of something that can scale with your business. And I don't just mean with the size of your business, I mean throughout a working day for your business. And tools and techniques which we've been learning and deploying with a number of customers to go and take the flexibility of fabric, but also to go and make it very, very cost effective for the customer, to make sure that we're not just going for the highest SKU we think that is possible, and giving clients the ability to bring the SKUs up and down in line with workloads. So some really important stuff there. I think that, one, as I said, fabric licensing overall is pretty easy to understand. But I think it's important to go and manage the costs, and there's some great ways of doing it, and everybody's going to talk about that today. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to everybody to go and to carry on with this presentation. Govind, who's the first speaker?
I guess maybe we can start with the fact is we're the Houston user group, right? So I think thanks everyone for joining. And obviously, as you can tell, Andy is our designated MC. Whether in person or online, is the best one when it comes to rounding the group up. Maybe, Andy, we can start with a little bit of your introduction, and then we'll go through the introduction. You guys are on the introduction slide now, right? Just want to make sure you guys see what I'm seeing.
I can see
I'm
that.
not seeing anything, by the way. Sorry, I don't know if it's something on my side. It says can't display content.
All right, let me stop the share and then reshare.
I don't know if it's for others as well, but I can't see. Just see.
I can see. Yeah, I can actually see that slide. Yeah, I'm good.
Let me try doing that again.
We've got a comment for somebody to say they can see.
Okay, then let me try to disconnect and reconnect just to be sure. Good. Maybe it's some Teams.
I just stopped and restarted, but let's see if that works. All right. While Nicola is doing that, Andy, if you could do your introduction.
Yeah, hi. So my name is Andy Clark. So I'm Power BI lead consultant for Clearly Solutions. I also run the Greater Houston Power BI user group and work alongside Khaled in terms of supporting him with this particular user group. Despite my accent, I am actually based in Houston, where I live and work. That's me.
All right. Govind, while we wait for Nicola.
Yeah, so hello everyone, I am Govind and I have close to 8 years of experience in data engineering. So I initially started with SAP and then moved with Azure services, and my experience with Azure services like Data Factory, Databricks and Synapse helped me to learn Fabric very quickly. And today we are going to see about fabric cost, which is kind of something very new. And we are going to also talk about how you can manage that. And compared to other Azure services, this one is going to be very interesting because there are a lot of things that you can do with fabric cost. So excited to be presenting. Thank you.
Khaled, just very quickly, Joseph Federo has put something in the chat. So he thinks that the attendees may be able to go and move the slide presentation backs and forwards. So just make sure that you've got control. Otherwise, we're going to be having some fun.
I was kind of looking. I don't know whether there's a way to turn the control off unless I go share my screen. I can try doing that maybe.
Yeah, because I can navigate forward and backwards, I think. So
I think you can navigate backward and forward, but it will not change the view for everybody. I think you have to kind of sync to the live view or something.
Okay. It's a feature of Team Share, says David Hunt.
We need a session on that.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's keep going. Khaled, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. I'm an accidental data professional that started off in finance, somehow ended up in data. So I'm not sure whether I've gone to the dark side or the light side, but here I am today. I'm the principal of Data Crafters. We help people with Fabric and Power BI all day long. And last but not the least, who probably doesn't need any introduction, but Nicola, would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, he's there. Sorry, Nicola.
No problem. Yeah, my name is Nicola. I'm originally from Belgrade, but I live for the last 8 years in a wonderful city of Salzburg in Austria, working as an independent data platform consultant and trainer, focusing mostly on Power BI and Microsoft Fabric. And I'm really happy to join these three folks and to chat about Microsoft Fabric and its pricing model today.
Awesome. So I think in general, if you guys have questions, feel free to ask questions in the chat, right? We'll try to get to it as we can, right?
And I'll keep it on the chat. Yeah, I'll keep it on the chat, Khaled.
Yeah. And at the same time, I think we're probably not going to talk too much about capabilities. We will talk about it a little bit in places, but I think we really want to get to a point where kind of show some different ways you can use them and whatnot. Regarding the meeting is going to be recorded and it will be published on YouTube. Give us maybe sometime in the week or something like that. We'll get that to you guys as well. And we'll probably put the PowerPoint in LinkedIn as well. So you should be able to find it there as well. All right. So I think to understand the costing of Fabric, I think there's one concept that we need to talk about first, and which is the separation of cost. From the perspective of Fabric, I think there's mainly two costs. There's a third one, but which we still trying to understand, which is minuscule at this point, but might have more details later on, which we'll touch on, but not go into depth. But essentially, understanding the cost of Fabric requires us to understand that when we have Fabric, we will be billed for two different things. One is the cost of compute, and the other one is storage. So essentially, whenever we're buying the Fabric SKUs, you're buying the compute. The storage is based on usage, and it's essentially scaling as we need. I'll give you my 2 cents on why I think this is important. In the old days, when we were buying something, essentially, the storage and the compute scale linearly. Meaning if you needed more storage, you would need more compute. If you need more compute, you need more storage. However, in real life, you need them separately, not all on at the same time. And from that perspective, the computes and the storage separation became important, both from a cost perspective, but also capability perspective. Cost perspective, because storage in general has become a lot cheaper, right? So being forced to buy a higher compute because you need larger storage doesn't make sense. That's kind of one part. The other part is we also need higher compute for small transformations and large transformations for small periods of the time, and ending up with a large storage doesn't make sense, right? So I think that's from a cost perspective, but in terms of capability perspective, is that the separation allows us to use the same storage for multiple computes. So you can have different users using the same storage without being impacting each other. So that's kind of my thought process for why this is important. But again, this is already baked into our like Fabric price right now. Any thoughts, Nicola, Govind, Andy?
I would just add that this is not something specifically related to Fabric. This is like a concept in all products and all vendors in last few years. Let's put it that way. But yeah, it's also incorporated in Fabric.
Absolutely. I think right now, if you look at any of the leading vendors, whether it's Snowflake, Databricks, and Fabric, all of them follows the same methodology of separating the storage and compute cost.
That is true. And remember the dedicated SQL pool where we cannot independently scale up storage and compute separately. So with Fabric, we can do that. Yeah.
All right. So in general, when we're looking at the cost, I think the computation cost is essentially, it's the CUs. We'll kind of talk about that a little bit later, but it's in the SKUs that we buy. It doesn't really go by t-shirt size like Snowflake, but it goes by numbers starting at F2 and whatnot. We'll look at those details, the storage cost, and then there is a concept of networking cost when your compute is in one region and storage is in different one. But we don't even have enough documentation or clarity to give you more details on that. So for the time being, we're not going to go into that. But essentially, when you're thinking about Fabric costs, these are the overarching parameters we're kind of working through. Now, we will cover the storage cost first and then kind of go into more into compute, because storage cost is quite simple, as simple as it gets, right? So it's based on the data, actual data being stored in your storage, right? And you're always paying for the storage. The only exception is if you're using the feature of mirroring from Snowflake, SQL, and then Postgres. Postgres is the other one, right, Govind?
Cosmos.
Cosmos DB,
Cosmos,
Snowflake,
yeah.
Azure SQL Server. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think those, when you're mirroring them, so for mirroring, you do get a free allotment of essentially based on the size of capacity you're using. So as you can tell, if you're on F2, you get 2 terabytes worth of free memory mirroring storage, right? So essentially Microsoft trying to incentivize you to move the data. One thing to note, I think this is something I think Nicola brought out, you get it free if the capacity is running. You get charged for the mirrored data if the capacity is not running. But I think primary from a storage perspective, there are 3 types. The standard one lake storage, where you're storing data in your lakehouse, warehouse, your Delta Parquet files, or even if you're storing from audio, video, whatever files you're trying to store there, you'll get charged for that. Key thing to highlight, there's no disaster recovery for those, right? You're paying about $23 a terabyte or 23 cents a gigabyte or so, right? So it's not something that's gonna break your bank. And then finally, the disaster recovery is charged less, but essentially you have to turn it on for each one of the storage. And the one lake cache applies for KQL cache storage and data activator. As you can tell, that is priced a little bit higher. It's about 24 cents a gigabyte versus the 2 cents for people who are using the real-time analytics and things like that. Questions, comments? All right. Okay, Let's see how do I get this to move. All right, so I think before we jump into compute, I'll put Nickel on the spot. I think one of the key things to understand in Fabric storage cost is the compression, right? So like this is very important to understand because it's not always apples to apples. If you have a data lake with 5 terabytes worth of data in CSVs and whatever format, right? If you're on Parquet format, it's a separate story. But if you have it stored in CSVs and text files and whatnot, there's a huge compression advantage. Nicola, would you maybe kind of go a little bit more into that?
I'll try to explain as simple as possible and as short as possible. So essentially, Parquet is famous for its compression algorithms, which helps to achieve much better compression rates compared to other formats. To give you an example, if you have a CSV file which is, I don't know, 500 megabytes in size, in Parquet with all compressions, it can be like maybe 20 megabytes. So it's up to, I don't know, 10, 20 order of magnitude compression rate that you can save if you use Parquet file format. And it's nowadays it's de facto standard for all these analytic workloads. And I'm not surprised that Fabric also adopted Parquet as their and Delta as their main storage option. So I would say what Khaled mentioned, if you have a certain amount of data stored in other formats than Parquet, you might be surprised based on compression rate how much amount of space you can save.
Awesome. All right, so I think this is something that's realized, right? We have tested, I mean, I've gotten between 5 to 15 orders of magnitude compression when going into Delta Parquet. So let's go into the next one. All right. So now Fabric SKUs are essentially compute capabilities are split between F2 to 2048, right? As you can tell, we didn't put the price in here. We'll go into that. But I think when you're determining which capacity you need, you have to go at it from two perspectives, right? So first one is your workload. Essentially, what kind of workload you're trying to push through, whether that is on the ETL side or on the Power BI side on hosting, right? How many users hitting it, what gigabyte, like the actual workload, right? So what's the size of your tables, the transformation you run, you're running Spark and all that fun stuff, right? So that's the primary determinant. The second determinant becomes there are certain features that are only available at certain SKUs, right? So if you notice, F64 tends to be a cutoff, right? Which is equivalent to P1, the old P1. And this is where you get Copilot and stuff like that. But again, the other difference is the direct lake mode. The direct lake mode below F64 has limitations on how many rows per table you can have, right? And then there's difference in query concurrency in Spark notebooks. Anything else you want to highlight, Nicola, Govind?
I think we are good on this part. Like, highlighting the rows per table limitation is something very important.
So I think, as you can see, there's different number of virtual cores that we get with each one of them. One thing that I want to highlight is Fabric at this point is a superset of Power BI Premium and Power BI Embed capabilities, meaning whatever you could do in Premium, you could do in Fabric. Same thing with the Power BI Embed. So for example, P1 didn't require user licenses, neither does F64. But A4 on the other side, on the embed side, would use user licenses, but you could not create embed on Premium. But now in Fabric, you can do both, right? So I think which is a great thing. And this is the only time we're probably going to mention P1, P2, and stuff like that, because you can no longer buy them anymore. For the next 6 months or 5 months or so till July, if you have renewal coming up, you can renew for 1 year. So essentially, after December 31st, 2025, nobody's going to have premium. Everybody has to switch to Fabric. Regarding the ASKU, we don't know yet, but as you can tell, it's already a superset, meaning you already have that Fabric capabilities, the embed capabilities in Fabric. All right. Next one is Govind. You want to give a little bit idea about bursting and smoothing before we kind of go into the pricing and stuff like that?
Sure. So bursting is the technical name, but what I would like to call it as fabric on adrenaline rush, right? So adrenaline rush basically helps you to do things normally you wouldn't be able to do, right? But it is only for a short time. The same way in fabric capacity, let's say you are running queries and you are running queries in F2 capacity. In that case, ideally, most of the time the queries will be running within the capacity, but sometimes you might require a little bit more power for your queries, but it is not like a continuous use. Only for a very short time, you would need a higher capacity. In that case, it doesn't, it is not easy to scale up and scale down only for those particular queries, right? It might be just a query that is running for like 5 or 10 seconds. You don't want to do that scaling up and scaling down. So that is where Fabric has an inbuilt feature which is called as bursting. So this bursting allows you to scale up your capacity. It is done automatically, so you don't have to do anything. It is done automatically, and when a query is running beyond its beyond the compute power of a F2 capacity, it will automatically burst. And for F2 capacity, it can go up to 32 level, 32x, meaning like multiplied by 32, you can get the power of that particular compute for your queries. So yeah, I will wait for the presentation to sync. Yeah, thank you. So in this case, if you are running a query that is kind of like using the bursting capacity, it can go up to F64 compute level and then it can come back. But given how adrenaline rush works, the same way this bursting, it will work only for a few seconds. So it is not like a continuous use. If you think about it, the queries might run in bursting mode only for maybe like 30 or 45 seconds, not more than a minute, or more than like 2-3 minutes, right? So this is where the bursting capability allows you to scale up for a very short time. You don't have to do that. It is a auto scale, and for each capacity there is a multiplier. For F2 it is at 32x, and F4 again 32x, like that it goes on. For a higher level of capacities, the bursting multiplier is a little bit low compared to the lower capacities, lower power capacities, right? So bursting, I mentioned about how it can go to a higher level and come back, right? But this is not for free, meaning like it is included in the price that you pay for 1 hour of compute capacity. But the thing is, when you do that bursting, what happens is the compute that you consume, it is smoothed out such that the cost is divided across multiple hours, right? So when you are paying let's take this F2 capacity, it is less than $1, right? And when you are using that compute to run a highly compute requiring query, so it will burst up and then it will come down again. This highly highly computed query, it will consume some capacity units. That capacity units, what happens is it is smoothed out such that it will be divided across multiple hours, and the cost that you are incurring is also smoothed across multiple hours. So this bursting and smoothing is more of like a combination. So one does not happen without the another, and bursting and smoothing makes it very easy for us to run not long running queries, like highly compute requiring queries, but only for a short time. And whatever compute that you incur, it will be smoothed across so that you don't have to scale up every now and then, right? So the smoothing allows you to kind of like save cost without having to scale up only for a specific queries that you might be running for maybe less than a minute, right? So bursting and smoothing is a combination. So yeah, any questions on this or any comments, Khaled, Nicola?
No, I think this is a really good feature, but this has a humongous double-edged sword that so essentially with bursting comes smoothing and throttling once you have overused the capacity, right? And the reason I say this is a double-edged sword is because this happens automatically, meaning you cannot control it. So if someone pushes it to the limit, the most challenging thing that can happen is a user goes and opens up the Power BI report and says capacity maxed out, come back in a little bit, right? So I think that is the biggest challenge I kind of face with that. But I think with that, maybe let's kind of jump right into the cost and things like that, right?
Yeah.
So the standard cost patterns, if you think about it, right, we have two options, right? We can, like in Azure services, we can do pay as you go, right? So it's done by the second or the minute. I think the billing perspective, how long a capacity runs, right? You can essentially you're charged for how long the thing was running at which capacity, right? So I think the flexibility and things like that about that is great. Now you might need it to keep it running all the time, right? So essentially you're willing to make a commitment to Microsoft that you will be using it. And from that perspective, they would essentially give you a discount. But at that point, regardless, you keep it running. You can, like the thing, most common confusion people thinks that you have to keep it running. You don't have to. But at the same time, even if you don't keep it running, you'll still be billed for it, right? So I think that's the key things to understand when it comes to reservation. And as you can see, this is essentially a table for South Central. Prices do vary between regions. This is the most common standard thing we see in the US. North Central, South Central, East is about the same price. West a little bit more expensive. But as you can tell, it starts at $260 a month to about $269,000 a month. So if you need the power, it will scale, but you'll pay for it. If you are willing to do reservations, as you can say, you get roughly about 40% or so savings, right? I put a link on there with the like if you're trying to figure out how to buy reservation and whatnot. Andy Cutler has it does Andy Clark, but
it definitely isn't this Andy Clark.
It's actually Andy Cutler. We gotta go fix that before we send it out. But it's Andy Cutler has a great blog about it, how to do the reservations for fabric capacity, right? So if you think about it, this is what it kind of looks right. If you run a F64 on pay-as-you-go versus reservation, the cost per day, right? The reason we show this is because we'll kind of show different patterns when we kind of get to it later. Let's see if this thing actually loads in this format. Or maybe I'll kind of show this in my actual format. Right? So this is essentially something we kind of built in-house from a PowerPoint perspective, right? Like a Power BI perspective. So if you run it for 24, for example, US South Central, F64 reservation versus pay as you go, what's the price difference? Technically, you have to kind of go down to about 15-ish hours where the cost is almost equal, right? So the option of turning on and off, right? That's kind of the break-even point. So if you're running it more than 14 hours, that's essentially the cutoff point, because think about it, it's a 40% savings. If you're running the fabric capacity about 14 plus hours, that's essentially the cutoff. I mean, the savings dollar would be different, but the percentage and things like that is roughly the same. All right. Now let's go back into the presentation. Let's see if it allows me to do this right.
So we're getting some, Khaled, I think we're going to come to all of this. So we're getting some questions about the flexibility of, of being able to go and switch SKUs while you're working. I think we're going to deal with that, aren't we? There's also some questions about switching from pay-as-you-go to reservation. Another question we've got is that somebody had a POC with trial capacity and not able to go and use the cheapest workload with the region. I don't know if anybody else has seen that. So that's what's coming up in the chat. So if anybody's got,
so I think I'll cover the trial one, but I think in terms of scaling up and down, you're going to see that in a second, because that's literally what this session's about, right? So I think if you think about the trial is an F64, right? So like essentially F-150 won't be able to pull a plane. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not that familiar with the tonnage capability, but like you would need the appropriately sized engine to pull based on what workload you're trying to do. If you build stuff on trial, a trial is an F64 F64, which is equivalent to a Power BI P1. So essentially a $8,400 a month on pay-as-you-go versus that, right? Versus F2 might not be able to pull the load what you were able to run it on a trial, right? So I think that's kind of the one thing that you need to take a look into, is whether the cheapest capability failing to run the same thing that you built on trial, because it might require more horsepower to be able to finish. And this is one thing to note, because if it takes longer, it might take longer to finish, but because of the bursting and smoothing factor and throttling, sometimes those workloads will fail because it'll burst up and it will not be able to finish within the 5 minutes, and it'll be throttled and the workload fails, right? So that's one of the challenges of the bursting and smoothing. I'm guessing we'll eventually have option to control the bursting and smoothing to say, hey, scale up if it's pushed or whatnot, but I don't think we have that feature yet, like we used to have in Power BI Premium.
And the question has been clarified a bit, and I think it's about moving the capacity between regions, which for me I would say is a go to Microsoft thing. Open a service request and see if they can do that.
Oh, okay. So there is a nuance there. If you create the trial capacity, it's in your should be in your native tenant location, right? When you create stuff and the data is stored, not Power BI artifacts, but Fabric artifacts like Lakehouse and Warehouse, it is stored in that region. You cannot switch a region of a workspace for a data. So I think that's probably what it was relating to. This is something me and Govind found out the hard way. We created a bunch of stuff for demo, and we could not move the back it up by the same capacity because they're in two different regions. So whenever the first time you create any Power BI artifact and it gets stored in that region, you cannot switch it out of that region.
Okay, I hope that's answered your question.
All right. So I think this is one of the questions where it's like schedule on and off, right? So I think this is most common scenario is, say you're a US company, you work 8 to 5, and that's the only time you need it, or you have running batch processes for warehouses in the back end, right? So for those, you just need to run it for like a specific time, right? So for example, you can run it from 8 to 5, pay as you go, right? You cannot do reservation on this, right? Cost about $100 a day, right? So right off the bat, it can essentially shave off 2/3 of the cost, right? Now, the question is, how would you do that instead of like getting someone to turn it on in the morning and turn it off when they leave the office, right? What we use for those is we use logic apps, right? Here is a kind of like an example of logic app. If I get time, I can kind of open one up on our Azure side to kind of show it to you, right? Where we're running it on schedule, So it's checking at 8 a.m. If it's 8 a.m., it turns it off. At 5 p.m. when it runs again, it turns it off, right? The reason we use logic apps versus Power Automate, you can do the same thing in Power Automate as well. The reason we use logic apps is because the Azure Invoke resource and all that stuff are premium connectors. So it becomes quite expensive for other use cases when there's multiple users who need access to it. So compared to that, because we're already using the Fabric capacity in Azure, we prefer using the Logic app, which turns out pennies. I mean, I've not been able to get it over pennies, even if with this much run, right? So that's the scheduled on and off. Any questions on this one? All right, so this one I'll go through quickly. This is the scheduled on and off versus on demand, right? So we use this for learning. For example, we use it heavily for demo. So when we're showing Copilot capabilities, I don't want to have F64 running all the time. So for those, we essentially turn it on and off during when we exactly need it, right? So this is good for R&D. You want to try specific features. You want to have a capacity for learning and things like that. That's what we use for on demand, right? For this one, we actually use, again, Power BI with, again, it's not showing it right now, but essentially we have a button in a Power BI report which has the HTTP call of Logic Apps that turns it on and off when you click on it, right? Again, the reason we use Logic Apps, because it's cheaper for us to give all the users access to it without buying premium Power Automate license. Now, one of the problem with on and off, right? So essentially, it's literally nothing is available outside of the runtime, right? So if someone runs one query or something like that, the capacity warehouse, everything is turned off, right? So from that perspective, right, what we use the concept of scheduled scaling, right? So essentially, it ensures that the capacity is available during non-peak hours, right? It can, like I said, support periodical heavy loads. And one of the things that a lot of our customers use is they want to use Copilot, but they don't want to pay for Copilot all the time. So they have a scheduled time of the day when the capacity is backed by Copilot, so they can use questions and stuff like that, right? Any questions, thoughts? I think
No,
one key thing.
sorry, Khaled. So the only thing on the chat is about Hassan has asked a question. My Power BI Pro in West Europe, but we're based in the Middle East. So Fabric capacity, which region will they have to choose? If Power BI Pro, I think from what you said earlier, that therefore means that the
You don't
Fabric
actually have a
capacity is going to be
limit.
the same place as Power BI, isn't it?
I mean, you don't have to. I think the part with this one is you can have it in different regions. It's just you cannot switch it. I think so. Essentially, if you have if you create the Fabric workspace in a different region, right? You can put it in the cheapest region that's available to you. It just means you're going to have latency difference, right? So if you're in Middle East, your thing is in West Europe. I mean, if you put it in Middle East, I mean, you're actually going to get faster time than that. Now, the key is going to be if your Power BI Pro is pulling data from Fabric, right? There is a latency difference, like time latency to move the data between the two regions. But other than that, you don't have a restriction on being forced to pick one region versus the other. There is another grain to this to understand is for people who are dealing with what's that thing called GDPR and stuff like that, where you have to store and stage data differently based on location. Fabric makes it possible, right? If you, instead of using Pro, the moment you put the workspace and back it up by the same capacity within the Power BI artifacts, you are essentially compliant because the data is stored and staged in the like the location of your choice. So I think one thing that I was trying to highlight, I think, is which is important is if you scale a capacity while something is running, that process does not fail. Meaning, but it will not automatically switch that workload. It will switch the workload after that comes in to the new capability that if you scaled up or down, right? So that is important to understand. Otherwise, you'll be like, wait a minute, if every time I scale up and down, does everything that's in process breaks or not? It doesn't. Now, the schedule scaling, this is where you can get crafty, right? So essentially, you can keep the entire thing as pay as you go, or you can put portion of it in reservation, right? So even the schedule scaling, you can go about it from a pay as you go completely, or you can mix and match with reservation. And this is probably a good example of that. So here I'm running an F8, right? And then a F64 after that, right? This one is always run. So this part is always running F8. And then for the peak time, I'm going up to F64. Versus I get a savings by putting the F8 on reservation and F64 beating the time. Now, the interesting part of the calculus is you actually get a discount even when you're on F8, F64, even though because you're on reservation for the first 8 CEUs, you get discounts, not for the other 56, right? And this is covered very well in the blog from Andy Cutler, where when you buy a F64, actually when you buy the 64 CUs for reservation, you can have two F32s running, you can have multiple ways of running it. You don't have to run F64, right? So that's kind of the blend of it, right? So I think that's how you can combine the scaling with reservation, which I find the ultimate pattern, right? So I think for a lot of our customers, what we end up doing is that they don't have heavy workloads for majority of the day. We only scale up for that portion, and then we just kind of run it to where their usage is. So we will always start with the pay as you go. Once we figure out the standard usage, we'll buy reservation for that and scale up for the heavy workload transformations and stuff like that. All right. Let's see if we go to the next slide. Now, this is essentially the logic app for scaling up and down, right? If you guys are interested on all this logic apps, we will probably try to put some blogs together out there. But if you guys are interested, if you have interested in that, we can try to put a presentation together on how to build this logic apps to control Fabric, obviously. Now, the one other part I want to cover is what we call a dynamic pattern, right? So all we have talked about right now is based on schedule, right? You're turning it on off at 8, turning it off at 5, or on 8 and 9 and whatnot. But there is one more scenario or pattern I want you to think through is we can create a dynamic pattern, right? So which essentially is you can create a pipeline, right, in Fabric, where the pipeline kicks off by calling a logic app that scales it up, right? And then after that, you run through your heavy workload. So think about you're running heavy like workload in the morning. Your first pipeline turns on, which is the like say the pipeline of pipelines, right? And you turn on the logic app, call the logic app to scale up to send F64. And then you're running all your pipelines to do that. And on completion of those, it calls the logic app again to scale it down. The advantage of this approach is that it's dynamic in the sense that it will, if it might take 35 minutes to finish, it might take 1 hour to finish, but it is not gonna scale down and like your workloads failing, right? So that's kind of one of the other patterns I think you need to kind of think through. All right. So I think what we covered right now are essentially think about the levers you can pull, right? From enterprise design, like when for an enterprise organization, you're going to end up with multiple capacities and very few, like quite a few different things, right? And then from that perspective, I want to talk to like two concepts, like essentially is a workload separation and the development cycle separation, right? So from a workload separation perspective, given the bursting and smoothing and the consumers versus developers need, right? One thing that you should think about for a larger organization is to put the data engineering versus Power BI artifacts in separate capacities, right? So that a massive transformation or a Spark job doesn't max it out and your CEO or CFO gets a capacity maximum error, right? So that's usually a best practice. Even from Snowflake Databricks perspective, we use separate capacity from a transformation engine versus like the analytics engine, right? That separation usually is very helpful. And the final one I think I want you to think through is the dev, test, and prod. For organizations large enough, we need to separate the capacities, right? You don't necessarily need to run the prod full time. Sorry, prod, like the dev and test running at the same capability as prod, right? So from that perspective, one of the other variable you are going to have to manage from a fabric cost perspective is how you separate them, right? And it's obviously medium to large organization problem, right? When you're dealing with the DevOps deployments and all that fun stuff, right? I'll switch to questions in a second. I think the one part I want to highlight is we kind of showed you the different levers, but in reality, it's not one or the other, right? You're going to end up using multiple different things, right? So you might be using F16 for a portion of the day. You might give the users x64 for using certain features during the day, right? So real life is a mix and match of what you do, but it is always an implication of how you pull the simple levers to get what you need. I think we will essentially probably stop for questions for a little bit, and then I want to come back and have Govind cover the capacity metric app.
So we've been asked about, I think Govind's been answering things as you go. So roadmap from Microsoft about auto scaling for capacity-based usage, and we don't have anything for that right now. Nicola, thank you for putting the blog link in the chat for those people. Another Khaled asked for big organizations, got multiple locations in different countries, how to deal with capacity by region.
My personal preference is unless you have legal requirement to leverage the same like preferred region, right? Because when you're in the pro or premium per user scenario, right, you can only leverage one region, right? So kind of basing off the same thing, I think centralizing into one region is a preferred approach. But obviously you differ from that from a legal requirement perspective, especially if you're dealing with GDPR and sensitive data and stuff like that.
Yeah. And Nicola, thank you for putting some things into the chat there about a blog post talking about auto scale as an up and coming feature. And then there's another blog in there on that topic on auto scaling to go and handle pricing. So any other questions anyone wants to put in the chat?
There's a question on the Q&A where is it recommended to utilize a layered approach to compute resourcing? I would probably need a little bit more clarity on what do you mean by layered approach. Steve Eric, I'm guessing Steve Enk. Hold on, I can probably figure out a way to unmute you. Hold on a second. Peoples. Any thoughts, Andy or Govind, what the question might mean?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Yes, I was also not fully understanding that.
So Steve, I think figured out a way to enable your mic. If you don't mind coming off mute and maybe it'll give us a little bit more details on that.
Yeah, I guess what my question is more around is making sure that for different, and I think it kind of got answered through the process, through the rest of this, was having different compute layers for different times a day, and kind of buying different and having different computes for different times a day, different purposes, and managing that accordingly is from a multi-layered approach to it, rather than kind of a one-size-fits-all scenario to try so that we're because again, I've had experience with dealing with Azure compute and whatnot, and there are times that it can just go completely haywire and out of control if you're on the pay-as-you-go model. So it's kind of trying to make sure you manage it appropriately. So
I think that's a very good point, Steve. I think I think it was Marco Russo saying, I think if you ask a question, is this always the best practice? He will say depends, right? So I think if you're absolutely right. I think you'll have to figure out what your usage is, right? I think like my general things is, I'll always start at F2, right? So I'll start with minimum capacity and minimum usage and figure out only go up when you need to. I mean, it kind of gives away my finance background, right? But in terms of how you design it, you'll have to figure out your usage requirement, right? Because like one thing I usually see is we'll go by F64 because we want to use Copilot, right? It's not something people use all the time, right? So I think from that perspective, working with your organization, saying that, hey, I can give you that capability for this time, or give them a button. They can click on it and it will scale up and whatnot. Just use it from that perspective, right? Okay. And business usually willing to understand the price difference, right? Because you are paying $11, $12 for an hour of usage versus paying additional, say, $5,000 to keep it running all the time, right? And again, it depends on the size of organizations. For very large organizations where you have multiple mega capacities running, at that point, it doesn't make a difference. But the reason I want to highlight the cost concept is because there is an Excel cost calculator. I'll kind of put it out there a little bit later. I can show it to you guys, but one of the things that we find out is like one of our smaller, like because we work with a lot of SME, right, small to medium enterprises, and they use Fabric mainly for backend. They don't use the Direct Lake or any of that stuff. So they're using for consumption is either in Pro or PPU, right? And their Fabric cost is $400 a month, and they use F64 portion of the day, right? Because only when the massive pipelines are running with 3 ERPs and whatnot, they need about F64 for an hour. But for the rest of the time, it's an F2 running on reservation, so that when other people does one-time refresh and stuff like that, that doesn't require F64, right? Because it's only running one pipeline or one query for one user and whatnot, right? And that's kind of the beauty of Fabric, that it makes it very accessible to different size organizations. And also people might say, I'm a large organization, how that impacts us. Even in large organization, a department might be a small entity, right? So from that perspective, from a trial and error and getting them off of Access and Excel database, this is, I think, what Fabric unlocks for a lot of users. All right, I think, any other questions?
Nicola has been, thank you, Nicola, answering in the chat. Marcella, regarding the Gen 2 backup in, has that been answered?
All right, there you go. I think the last part, I think, Govind, if you can cover the capacity matrix, I think this is probably one of the best way to kind of figure out.
That is true, Khalid. So whatever items that we use in Fabric consumes a particular amount of capacity that we run, right? So how to monitor that? So most of the data analytical tools, they provide a particular monitoring view to do that, right? So in Fabric, we have the capacity metric app, and here you can monitor all the data related to how your items run, how much consumption it makes on your capacity, and what is the workload at different timings of your day, right? So you can monitor all of them. You can get an idea about how the Fabric capacity is utilized, so that you can make decisions accordingly. So all this scale up that we had shown, periodically switching off the capacity, all of that important decisions you can decide based on this capacity metric app. So before we jump into capacity metric app, Khalid, can you go back to the previous slide? Yeah. So thank you. So it's just a small calculation that I wanted to show. So if you have a F2 capacity, it basically means like for 60 minutes and into 60 seconds, meaning like for each minute you have 60 seconds, right? You multiply by that. And then for F2, you multiply it by again 2 capacity units, which gives you 7,200 CU seconds. Okay. So this is a important metric because this is how you would be monitoring your capacity metric app to see which items use how much CU seconds basically. And as the capacity is scaled up, for example, for F4, you will be multiplying by 4 capacity units and so on like that. So the number of CU seconds that you get for a particular hour is how you can see the items that are being run in your capacity, how much it utilizes. So you can go to the next slide, column. Yeah. So for this one, I am going to show active capacity metric app from our organization. So Khalid, I will take over the screen sharing.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Are you able to see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. So when you have a Fabric capacity in your Azure environment, right? So you not just Azure environment. If you even have a Fabric trial capacity that is running on your workspace, so you can have capacity metrics app, and if you are a capacity administrator, you would be able to see the corresponding this metrics in the capacity metric app. So this is a separate app that you need to install, and just like how you install other apps in Power BI Workspace, the same way you can go to the app marketplace and then install this one. And when you install that and open that, you will get this capacity name as a drop down, and whatever capacities that you have access as a capacity administrator, you would be able to see all of them, and you can pick and choose which capacity you want to look at the metrics, right? So in this capacity metric app, it is a very detailed, I would say, dashboard. And I would say it would even require a separate session to explain all of the things. But right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just explain the most important ones that will help you to monitor your usage and accordingly scale up or pause your capacities. Okay, so the first one is the CU, right? So I showed you that CU seconds, right? And that is how you can measure which items use much of your computation power, right? So in the first KPI that we are seeing, it is a multimetric ribbon chart, which basically kind of like shows you the consumption pattern across different fabric items. So if you see here, we have data flow, event stream, lakehouse, some of the items that we have in our workspace, and you can see how a particular type of item in fabric consumes the capacity units, right? So let's say you have multiple workspaces, and some users use Dataflow Gen 2 and some users use Notebook. So you can easily see which one consumes more capacity units, and based on that, you can accordingly go and optimize that, right? So this is going to be your best way to see which items consume more capacity compared to the rest, right? So when you are implementing something, let's say a transformation, whether it is good in Dataflow Gen 2 or is it in Notebook, meaning Spark Notebook, or is it in T-SQL, all of that you can get an idea from this particular chart, okay? And coming to the next one, CU percentage over time. So this is more of like how the consumption pattern is across multiple days. So if you see here, we have a time, slider that allows you to kind of like go back in time and see where and all, you have consumed this capacity and how much is the percentage of consumption, right? Right. So here, the main advantage of seeing this is how much CU percentages you are consistently using, and let's say it is always around the higher mark, it means that your capacity is overutilized and you need to scale up so that some of the things, meaning like some of the items which don't run in a efficient way, it can be run more efficiently, right? So it's basically like if your compute unit is overutilized, you need to accordingly scale up the capacity that you have. And we will speak about throttling next. And before that, I can, kind of like zoom in on a particular day and see how the pattern is. And I can also click on a particular, item. And if I click on explore, it will show a more detailed version for that particular item, not item, the particular, what is that,
Time slot.
point in the time. Yeah, so I can see all the items which had consumed how much CU units. All of this I can see here, and you can see this total CU seconds, right? So this is the one that I earlier talked about. So for a F2 capacity, you will have 7,200 CU seconds for 1 hour for consumption, right? So here you can see how much CU seconds has been consumed by a particular item that you have. So it is at a item level granularity, not even the item category. You can see which item exactly consume how much of CU seconds, right? So this is one major advantage that comes with capacity metric app, and you can see what are all the items that consume much of the capacity that not capacity CU seconds that you have, right? And let me go back, and kind of like you can click on that explore and get more details. And next is the throttling. So Khaled had mentioned about how throttling happens when you consistently burst your queries, and after some time the smoothing also maxes out and you don't get any particular compute power to run, right? So if you see this throttling happening at 100% consistently, again this means that your capacity is overutilized, and you can scale up periodically, or if necessary you can kind of like scale up to a much more higher capacity for the entire month, right? Like that you can decide. So this capacity metric app, the multimetric ribbon chart, utilization percentage, throttling, all of this helps you to see whether your compute power is it underutilized or overutilized, and I can make accordingly the changes. And not just on a higher level, you can even go at a hour level and see when my capacity is at peak and whether I need to scale up for that particular hour alone. It is a very common scenario, right? Like the pipeline's running at morning time before the reports get refreshed. So this is a very common requirement, and you can see whether when the pipeline runs, whether it is overutilized, the compute power is overutilized, and you can make accordingly the scale up pattern that we had talked about. So this is with respect to compute. We also have a page for storage, and storage allows you to see what are all the different workspaces and how much consumption in terms of storage it takes, right? So this one, if you think about storage, it's very cheap compared to compute. But again, we have this Delta Lake, right? And Delta Lake, if you are not running vacuum once in a while, it is going to accumulate the older versions of the data, meaning like the Delta Lake supports time travel, and you need to kind of like run vacuum once in a while so that the older versions which are no longer required can be deleted, right? So you can see from this top 10 workspaces which workspace consumes most of the storage, and you can check whether you need to run vacuum or you need to change your ingestion way, like whether you are doing an append or is it more of like a upsert. All of this you can basically identify by using this capacity metric app for storage. So any questions in this? Khaled, Nicola, you have any comments? Andy?
I think there was a question about how long data is available. I think, can you have it longer? I think this is where I think we have to kind of go back to storing the data ourselves. I think it goes back about 30 days or something like that, right?
Yeah,
Govind, or
I think it is 30 days. Maybe we can check and get back on that.
yeah, so I'm not exactly sure, but there is a limitation on how long that's available. If you want to keep it longer than that, then you have to store and rebuild.
That is
But
true.
I think compared to what we used to get in Power BI, this is a humongous improvement where we had to kind of do everything ourselves. And I think there's a lot of pretty cool stuff coming from Power BI perspective as well.
Yeah. Compared to the monitoring in Power BI, I guess this is more of like, I would say it is much more, not larger, it's more detailed. Like you can go
Yeah.
and check which particular item is consuming my capacity more. Yeah. Okay, so that's it about capacity metric app. And Khaled, I would like to hand over the session back to you.
Yeah. So I think one thing I'll just quickly show is this is what I was kind of talking about, right? So I think this is what we've been playing around in-house internally, right? So it's like you pick a capacity that you want, region and whatnot, right? Pay as you go, run it all the time at $8,400. Reservation, $5,003. Schedule turn and off, right? This is the time I'm running it from 8 to 9 a.m., right? And run on weekends, right? You might need to not need to run it on weekends or not, right? And now the scale up and down, right? So what's your base capacity F2 or whatnot? Um, and again, this is what I was talking about for one of our use cases where you need larger capacity for a portion of the day, a very small time to run the pipeline. Apart from that, it runs on F2 to give availability to others. Give us a little bit of time. We'll probably put this on the web somewhere where you can get access to this. And then we're kind of working on trying to build a version of this online using Fabric. So once we get this up and running, we'll let you know. So we are trying to use Streamlit and stuff like that with testing some stuff, building it out. And once we get that out, we'll make it available to you guys. All right, I think at this point, I think pretty much that's all we had from a presentation perspective, right? And I can go back to the presentation. So I think this is what Govind already covered. Do follow us on join the meetup group on meetup. Here's a QR code if you want to scan. That's for you to be in touch with all the ones that we're doing. We're probably going to do one more virtual maybe in September or so, but probably in October we'll try to go back to in person before we come back again. And the final but not the least, I guess, if you want to get a hold of us, I think LinkedIn is probably the easiest place to get a hold of most of us. And I'll put in the chat our LinkedIn profiles. So you guys can do that. Any other questions, Andy, I missed in the middle? Oh, there's a question from Keith.
Sorry, I think most of them were picked up by Govind and Nicola.
I think the question, Keith, you're asking about was the price of F2 in the US, right? It depends where you are in, right? So F2 North, apart from West Coast, I think it's about $261 or something per month on pay-as-you-go and $160 on reservation. West Coast is about 10-20% higher. Any other questions? Oh, the Logic app. Do you guys want like a show and tell type thing, like more like a workshop? Because I think we can show that. I think this is a significant amount of R&D which has gone in this year. So we can definitely plan to do that. Maybe, Andy, what do you think? Nicola?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think that's worth the session?
I think totally. It is. I think it's an important aspect for all of this. Yep.
Sounds good. So, all right, we'll take that feedback. I think for the next session, we'll maybe do one a little bit later, September, October timeframe. We'll do a full-on Logic app, and I'll bring the heroes behind the work that who actually built the Logic apps. I think we'll do kind of a hands-on type thing. Govind, maybe good idea for you to. That's a good idea to get your blog out and then put it on LinkedIn. That's the easiest way you can probably share that if they want the script for the backup.
So to answer your questions regarding PowerShell script, watch out for our Data Crafters blog. We will be posting one soon about how we can take that backup, and watch out for that blog.
And I just put in the chat what Copilot summarized the meeting. That is not Fabric Copilot, by the way. There's so many different. We probably need a session on to figure out which Copilot comes with which license. All right, thank you, everyone. I think we did a session on we did our last session on Fabric Copilot and features and stuff like that. You can find that session on YouTube as well. So I'll see if I can find a link to that. And we'll put that in the chat. Again, thank you, everyone, for making it out there. And thank you very much for questions, because it allows us to get better at it, to understand what we're doing. I think the challenge becomes there's so many foundational things we have to cover before we get into the reality, but we tried our best to keep it simple. And that credit all goes to Andy, because he chewed my head out saying that this was too complicated and technical yesterday.
Thank you for listening.
We try.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you so much for attending. That was great. Look, please let us know if you found it useful. We're getting some lovely comments from a bunch of people. Tarushi, thank you very much. One of Power BI Houston friends. And ideas for future sessions. I think we got a great one with Logic apps, but I think there's so much more we can do. But really appreciate the thoughts from everybody in the audience about what you find useful. So on that note, and I really need to go and walk the dog. So I need to get out of here.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Have a nice day.
Bye.
Bye.